The power went out just as I was about to pour myself a glass of wine. The house fell into silence, the kind that seeps into your bones, making everything feel heavier. I stood there for a moment, listening to the hum of nothingness, the rain tapping lightly against the windows. I reached for my phone, its screen casting a cold glow on my hands. One missed call from my husband. I hesitated before calling him back, already knowing what he'd say. When he answered, his voice was clipped, distracted. "What do you want me to do?" "I'm not there." I exhaled. "The power's out." A brief pause. Then, with a sigh, "I'll send my son over." I didn't argue, but something in my stomach tightened. I wasn't scared of the dark. I was used to being alone. It wasn't the silence that unsettled me. It was the way my thoughts grew louder when no one else was around. 30 minutes later, a knock echoed through the house. I opened the door, and there he was, rain dripping from his jacket, flashlight in hand. His presence always carried a certain weight, like he belonged in every space he stepped into. "Your dad said you needed help," he said, eyes steady on mine. The words sat in the air for a moment before I stepped aside to let him in. He walked in, shaking off the rain, the dim beam of his flashlight sweeping across the walls. The silence between us felt thick, like something unspoken had been sitting there for too long. I folded my arms, watching as he moved toward the breaker panel in the kitchen. "Probably just a tripped circuit," he muttered, kneeling to inspect the switches. I leaned against the counter, my fingers gripping the edge. The flashlight flickered as he adjusted it, casting shadows that stretched and shifted across the room. Then came the crash. A sharp, metallic clang as something toppled over in the dark. I flinched, my pulse spiking. "You okay?" I asked, stepping forward. "Yeah," he exhaled. But when I reached the doorway, I didn't see him immediately. Then, movement. My shoulder brushed against something solid. Him. I froze. The air between us charged, the dim light barely illuminating his face. He didn't move, didn't step back. Neither did I. The sound of the rain outside filled the silence. His voice was low, steady. "You've changed." A simple statement, yet it settled into my chest like a stone. I didn't ask what he meant. I already knew. I swallowed, my throat dry. The weight of his words hung between us, pressing against something I wasn't ready to name. His gaze held mine, steady, unreadable, as if waiting for me to deny it. But I didn't, because he was right. "I don't know what you mean," I said anyway, my voice quieter than I intended. The corner of his mouth twitched, something between amusement and understanding. "You do." The flashlight cast an uneven glow, making the kitchen feel smaller, the walls closer. He shifted slightly, but not away. The tension wasn't new. It had been there for months, simmering just beneath the surface, unspoken but undeniable. A crack of thunder rumbled outside, and I flinched, more from the moment than the sound. He noticed. "You okay?" I nodded too quickly. "Just tired." He studied me for a beat longer, then exhaled, stepping back at last. The absence of his closeness felt just as heavy. "I'll check the fuse box," he muttered, turning away. As he moved, I let out a slow breath, pressing my palms against the counter. I told myself this was nothing. Just a moment, just a trick of the dark. But deep down, I knew better. He crouched near the fuse box, the dim light casting sharp angles across his face. I should have left the room, given myself space to breathe, but I stayed, arms crossed, pretending to be unaffected. The silence stretched between us, tense and loaded. "The main switch is fine," he muttered. "Might be something overloaded." He reached for a cord, but in the darkness, something slipped from the counter. A glass, maybe. Instinctively, I moved forward at the same time he did. As I reached for the cabinet, a loud thunderclap shook the house. Startled, I stepped back too fast and collided with him. It was sudden, unplanned, but neither of us moved away immediately. My hands had landed on his arms, his on my waist, steadying me from falling. The space between us vanished, the moment stretched as silence filled the kitchen. And then it happened. Another thunderclap. even louder this time, making both of us exhale sharply in surprise. He was crouched by the breaker, carefully inspecting the wires, while I stood behind him holding the flashlight. I shifted slightly to get a better view, but my foot caught on something, making me stumble forward. No hesitation, no second guessing. His hands shot up instinctively to catch me before I fell. Just inevitability, a moment where I realized how clumsy I had been. A line crossed between caution and accident that neither of us could pretend hadn't been there all along. It was brief, yet enough to shift everything. My balance, my confidence, and most of all, my dignity. When we finally stepped back, his jaw tightened. Mine did too. A long pause, then his voice low. That shouldn't have happened. I nodded, but neither of us moved. The air felt heavier now, the room too small, the reality too real. Outside, the rain kept falling, indifferent to what we'd just done. Neither of us spoke. The weight of what just happened settled in the space between us, heavy and undeniable. I should have stepped back, created distance, acted like it was nothing. Instead, I stood there, my breath unsteady, my mind racing. He was the first to move. He turned toward the breaker panel again, forcing himself to focus. I should... His voice faltered, then steadied. I should fix this. I nodded, but my feet stayed planted. The logical part of me screamed to leave the room, pretend this never happened. But I couldn't. He flipped a switch. A spark. A flicker. Then, light. The kitchen was no longer hidden in shadows. Everything was exposed. Him. Me. The space we had shared in the dark, now illuminated. His eyes met mine, searching, unsure. And for the first time, I saw hesitation in him. Not regret. Just realization that we had crossed into something we could never walk back from. I exhaled slowly. This was a mistake. His expression didn't change, but something in his jaw tightened. Yeah, but neither of us moved. A car door slammed outside. My stomach dropped. My head snapped toward the window, heart pounding. His gaze followed mine, then darted back to me. We weren't alone anymore. I turned to him, panic creeping in. His hand brushed mine, just for a second. A silent message neither of us had time to process. Then, the front door opened. And just like that, the moment was gone.